right to start the beginning. So Eden, 20 years ago, Eden was built. And if you imagine back then, the context of Cornwall was quite interesting. So we had a region that had known great wealth in the Industrial Revolution and tin mining, and any Poldark fans in the room will know that actually Cornwall was the heartbeat of the UK industry at the time, and fishing and farming and mining were absolutely the mainstay of that local community. And over the years, through mechanisation, through various different government policies and everything else, that became much more complex. And by the 90s, Cornwall was in a bad space mentally. I think its confidence had been shot, and actually it didn't quite know what it was doing or what it was for. And actually its main economy was really the 6-week bucket and spade brigade holidays that were coming down. So you had a kind of seasonal workforce, pay was low, and Cornwall was not in good shape. And that was the time around when Michael Heseltine and the John Major announced the lottery and the Millennium Landmark program, and a guy called Tim Smith, who at the time had just created the Lost Gardens of Hellugan, which has now is the most visited private garden in the country, came up with this idea to build the Eden Project, and he persuaded the Millennium Commission to give him £39 million, which is no mean feat, to take this quarry, this clay pit in the middle of St Austell, and create this amazing garden. And the significance of that was quite interesting, because I guess the St Austell clay, China clay industry, 70s, was probably employing 5,000 people. Families were miners, grandparents, dads, sons, all lived in the mining industry, worked in the mining industry, a very paternal relationship with English China clay. And again, that by the 90s come down to about 1,000 staff, and people seeing clay pits, disused clay pits, as liability rather than assets. And then Tim took one of these, what was perceived to be a liability, and created this amazing asset. And I think the community, when we first started, when Eden was first talked about, you can imagine you had the Tate Modern, you had the Millennium Stadium, and you had the Millennium Dome making all of these great pronouncements. And I think we all remember that there was a broadsheet article, I'm not sure who it was by, whether it was the Times or the Telegraph, that said Millennium projects most likely to fail, and Eden was at the top of the list, right? And so that it's a bit like when your football club gets criticised, isn't it? Suddenly that galvanises people into saying, right, this is us against the world. And actually, for the Cornwall community, suddenly Eden became a kind of flagship about, actually, this is us proving to the rest of the country that Cornwall has something to offer. So you had this amazing support from the community to start with, and Tim had built about 15,000 strong Eden Friends group that started to kind of really do Eden's bidding for it, both locally and nationally, in terms of getting that widespread support for the project. And when Eden was first in construction, Tim had this brilliant idea of allowing people to come to the site to watch the big build. So people would come, they put a fluoro jacket on and a hard hat, and you would feel part of the creation of Eden, which I think gave that local community a massive sense of ownership on the project from very early days. And I think that was a really important part of embedding Eden in its local community. And I think Tim was really important, both in terms of getting that local link to come and support the project and watch it grow, but also going out to those village halls and really looking people in the eye and saying that I want to do this, it's going to be great for Cornwall, follow me. And I think that was a fantastic moment for Eden, and it really it embedded Cornwall within the local community in a really good way. And then so we opened 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day, 2001. So this year is our 20th birthday. And since then, about 23 million visitors have come through the gates of Eden. We'd originally anticipated that there may be 600,000 people a year coming to Eden, and then in year one, 2 million people turned up. And part of the raison d'etre for Eden at that time was that we wanted to be not just an international visitor centre, but a kind of a catalyst for economic transformation of Cornwall, really. So it was really important to us that we did things like have a local catering strategy and allowed 80% of our catering supplies to come from Cornish businesses, food suppliers, and that was a real challenge in terms of trying not to be the cuckoo in the nest in some of those conversations. But you know, we did a lot for economic impact in Cornwall, but we also did a lot in terms of changing people's aspirations and understanding of what might be possible in the county. And off the back of Eden, we saw, and the million people that were coming to Eden, we saw investment in Newquay Airport, Ryanair putting a flight on from London. We saw Jamie Oliver create Eden 15 down in Newquay, and we started to see accommodation providers investing in their product. And if you come back to Cornwall now, you know, the food and drink produce of Cornwall is absolutely top drawer. And now as a destination, it's not just about the 6-week summer holiday anymore. There's you know, you can come to Cornwall any time of the year and you will have a fantastic experience beyond the beaches. And I think Eden was a massive part of that process. You can argue that actually, you know, in our first couple of years, Eden was transformational in terms of the economy and in terms of what our community felt about us. And we clearly as a team were on a crest of a wave. We'd achieved this amazing thing. We created this amazing place that everybody wanted to come to. And I think, although some of us might have sensed it in our bones, actually the critical point in where we thought we've tripped over in our local relationship came in 2013, really. So just off the back of 2012, an amazing Olympic year, if you can all remember that. But also that year, you remember we were deep in austerity at that time, and we were also in the middle of probably one of the worst bits of weather the UK had seen for a long time. So there was these three things of recession, Olympics, and weather that had all come together, and Eden's visitor numbers had gone from 1 million to about 700,000, and we were in big trouble. We were facing some serious economic challenges, and I think at the same time, Kew Gardens were having a conversation with the government, and David Attenborough and the MP Zach Goldsmith at the time were really lobbying hard for government. Actually, you know, we should invest in Kew. We should invest in Kew. And actually, in our hour of need, when we needed help, no one came to help from Cornwall, politically or from London. So that was an interesting wake-up call for us, I think, in terms of what had happened to our relationship, both politically in Cornwall and with our local community, that this amazing asset could not garner enough support to help it through its big hour of need. And so, and at the time, we're probably really angry about that, and we're going, hang on a minute, how's this happened? How's this happened? But actually, I think for a few of us, we had felt that it was coming, and some of it was to do with about we needed to kind of recalibrate our relationship with the local community, and in particular, I think we needed to show a little bit of humility about how we got the success we got, and that actually there were a number of people around Cornwall who were critical in getting Eden's success that maybe we didn't acknowledge enough at the time. So we had a big reboot of thinking about Eden at that time. And if you think about Eden, it's really, you know, it is a public asset. It was funded by the lotteries, and I think that me as a member of staff, I'm just, you know, a custodian of this place passing through, and it's here for future generations. And so we felt we had to get back to a feeling where the locals felt that this was their project. We're a public asset. It's just like a park, and they should be using it more often. So we kind of coined this phrase that if Cornwall was a village, wouldn't Eden be the best village hall? And could we then start to think about our relationships with our local community in a different way than we had done before? And then there's two levels to that. There's the kind of the public policy, political end of that relationship, and then there's the community end of it. So in terms of our community, our kind of local politics end of it, we had a trustee at the time called Lady Mary Holborough, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Cornwall, and it's kind of almost like our very own Queen Mum. And if you ever got a letter from Lady Mary to attend an event, you would definitely turn up. So we asked her to write to the Great England of Cornwall and invite them for breakfast, and they came for breakfast. And actually what that did, it allowed us to speak to those people a bit more, and suddenly they become engaged in the project. And we did a summer party, and we invited them, a bit like the Buckingham House garden party, and suddenly they became engaged in the project. Then for our local community, we started to do things like we allowed them to fundraise on the Eden site for particular projects. So we supported Sleep Out and raised £10,000 a year for Sleep Out for the last 10 years to help the homeless charities in Cornwall. We did a Macmillan Cancer Research Programme. So we had this huge kind of reboot of what Eden was about. And a lot of that was to do with just handing our site over to the local community and saying, it's yours, how do you think you want to use this asset? So now you've got all these charities that are using Eden to raise money for their own work, even though Eden is a charity itself. We do things like social prescribing, so we've now got 100 people a week who come to Eden who are socially prescribed activities on the Eden site. And our membership program, which, you know, when we started was 15,000 people, and by 2013 had gone down to 3,000, is now back at 10,000. So we've just managed to kind of claw back this whole relationship with our local community and start to use more humble language in the way we talk about Eden, and particularly the way that there are a number of people in Cornwall who have been influential in our success, and we should never forget that. And that's been a kind of, I guess, the main point about going through these periods of tremendous success and then just losing our way a bit, and then just remembering to come back and being part of our community and embedded in our community. So that was where I was going to finish, Paul, but I'm happy to take questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. And it was just sort of really resonating with me as you were talking, because the parallels with universities, I suspect, for lots of us who were listening, are very obvious. And it reminded me of a sentence in the UPP final report where it talked about tests of a civic university. And one of the tests was, can people talk about our university, in inverted commas, with pride and awareness? And I think, you know, that's what you were saying in a way, is that you lost that feeling that Eden was ours in your community, and that was pretty catastrophic for you.
Absolutely, Paul, and I think you're right. Funny enough, I always have this sometimes, particularly in the kind of more economically deprived areas of Cornwall who struggle to get there. There's an intimidation about going into a university or coming to an Eden project, for example, and how do you break down those barriers and make them feel that they are welcome in those places is a really important part of the strategy.
Yeah, and you talked about, I guess, a shift in attitude, and again, the choice of the word humility, again, I thought was just really interesting. I can imagine how easy it was to get carried away with all of the excitement, and you know, you could do nothing wrong really. It was such a success story, but actually needing to sort of rediscover humility. So there's something about your kind of attitudes but there's also something about your behavior. You know, so I guess I guess the question for me was, what practically changed? You know, you don't become humble overnight. You know, what did you actually have to invest in that started to make that difference?
Well, I think we were really hurt by the fact that when we needed help of our community, they didn't come for that. I mean, that is the first thing, you know, that was a really painful part of our process, and I think that's the wake-up call. And I guess, you know, when you've got a charismatic CEO like we had, who is constantly driving for future and never standing still, you can sometimes be too bullish about that process. So it was about sitting down with trustees and sitting down with non-execs and going, okay, this is a deliberate strategy now about how we're going to change the way that we talk to our local community. Because before that, it was all driven by the million visitors a year became a kind of catalyst for, if you don't get 1 million, then maybe we won't be seen as being as glamorous as we might have been. And then that suddenly became everything. get the 1 million visitors, because then it means people will keep coming. And so it was just a change in that mindset. So when you don't suddenly have 1 million visitors and you're fighting for your life, then actually that requires you to think differently about the way that you manage your project.
Yeah, thank you. So please do use the chat, everybody, if you've got observations or comments on what Dan's been saying, or if you've got any questions. There's a raise hand function next to the camera at the bottom of the screen. Please do just reflect on what you've heard. And I just wondered, Emily, if you what sort of resonated for you while we wait, hopefully for some questions for Dan.
Absolutely, and thank you, Dan, for sharing such an honest account. I think we really wanted to make this session about the good, the bad, and the ugly around community engagement, and not just sort of that it is always easy and positive. And I just had a follow-up question just about, and you and I have kind of talked this through before, but just a few of the ideas that you use to really create. I love this thing of if Cornwall had a town hall, Eden would be the best town hall. It's a bit kind of Carlsberg, isn't it? And I love that framing. And I just wondered, how did you make that a reality for the community? What kind of activities? You mentioned a party, but I know that there were other things that you did. So I just wondered if you could share a bit of that.
Yeah, we did something that was well, we went obvious to start with. So on the 17th of March is also St. Piran's Day in Cornwall. So we created the World National Pasty Championships. So suddenly there was a direct correlation between the thing that every Cornishman has a connection to, food, and so we did that event, and around it we then invited charities to come and put up a trestle table and talk about their charity. And when you have 6,000 people on a site on one day, for some of those charities, that's an audience that they've never been in front of before. So there's a kind of like, they go, oh my goodness, you have to believe Eden's biggest asset is its platform and its ability to showcase what other people are doing. And if you're generous in giving that over, then I think people then suddenly get, okay, that's fantastic. So we did that. And then for our locals, particularly in November, December, we did free weekends for locals to come and ice skate. So whether it be Blue Light Brigade or whether it's NHS or the council, to just come in. Locals pass program, so you paid £15 and that was your pass for the year, but you could come in as many times as you want to bring that kind of park idea. This is just yours, use it. But that was easy for us because actually 80% of the people that were coming to Eden were visitors. And actually, if you've got friends down and they're staying at your house because they're in Cornwall, you go, God, where should we take them now? It doesn't cost us money. Well, let's go to Eden because we can get in for free. So there were things that we could do which were quick, easy wins that just allowed that kind of relationship to foster without forcing it down people's throats.
Mm.
I really like that, and I think it is obviously Eden is an enormous asset, as you said, so it's not not everybody has an Eden, as it were, but on the other hand it makes you think, I think, really creatively about if you have a space or you have a site, and a lot of us with universities do have sites and campuses, how can you make it somewhere that actually feels accessible and, as you said, a platform for the local community to use. And I think I really like the way that using free weekends, food. I think you mentioned also the concert series at one point that we talked about, in terms of people literally whatever you could have done in a town hall, you put on in a town hall. Because I know Oasis came and played there as well at one point, which I thought was fantastic. So
I think you have to. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Dan, we've got a few comments coming in chat, so I just thought I'd feed them in, and Mary, you've got your hand up, so in a second we'll come to you, Mary, if that's okay for your question. But Priya from Imperial says thank you for your honest and open reflections, and she loved your use of your phrase about using more humble language, as residents are key to our success. And Nick from Staffordshire, who's going to be speaking a bit later, talked about how important this learning is, and that community engagement can be painful. And she was once told that learning is not always warm and fuzzy, and that's stuck with me ever since. If we're doing it well, it should sometimes be uncomfortable, otherwise things don't change. So yeah, I thought those were very helpful. Thank you, Nick and Priya. So Mary, can we come to you?
Yes, thank you very much. That was outstanding, Dan. And it's really lovely from our perspective to understand that a project as big as Eden has the same problems that we face. And I've set up lots and lots of learning centres in communities, and so this absolutely resonates. And it's to me, it's always felt like a set of stairs. So you start at the bottom, you make the first leap, and everything's developmental. And then, as you say, you then have to realise you're at the next step. And I just wonder whether you've got planning now for the third step, which is what you do next, because it's going to keep moving because of the impact of the pandemic, and whether you've as a team, you now do kind of forecasting of what the likely trends are and what you'll have to do to keep engagement, to keep refreshing, because it doesn't stop, in my experience. You just got the next step and the next step, and you have to plan for the next one so that you don't end up like you just did with the experience you've had. And I just wonder whether you are planning for the next one, and now we're in completely different times with the pandemic, and I'd just be interested in your experience, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to say is that the pandemic, in a funny sort of way, has helped Eden, because we had this thing where people would come to Eden if they're on holiday when it's raining. So one day, if it was raining, you could have 10,000 people in a day, and then the next day when it's sunny, you have 4,000 people in a day, and it's really, really difficult to manage your cost base. So actually going to a timed ticketing system and knowing how many people are coming in and when they're coming in has absolutely transformed the way that we manage our cost base. So that point is really good. The other thing about the 2013 situation was that Eden the charity almost stopped being Eden the charity because no visitors were coming. So we had to find a different mechanism that gave us a greater resilience in our business model if visitors didn't come. So the idea since then has been, we've become a university campus, so affiliated to Plymouth University. We've now got 150 students doing horticultural degrees. They've got to put an Eden hotel on the site. And we're just about to install 5G technology in order to drive a more online audience around augmented and virtual reality. So there's a bit about Eden, the destination, becoming more resilient and becoming more flexible, and knowing that we're in the bottom left-hand corner in the southwest, and that's going to be difficult for quite a few people to actually come down and visit. So if you want global reach, how do you get global reach? So there's a lot of a digital strategy and 5G going on. And then there's the other bit about other Edens that might be in the pipeline. So for the UK, that's Morecambe, Dundee, and Derry. And then we've got China and New Zealand internationally as well. And all of that is about driving more income into Eden that makes the charity much more resilient and not so dependent on visitor numbers in case you get another pandemic or a foot and mouth or a recession or whatever else it is that just knocks you off course every now and again.
Fantastic, Dan. Thank you. Just briefly picking up on the idea of an Eden in Morecambe, Sarah Rees, who is based at Lancaster and our partners in the development of Eden at Morecambe, she thanked you for your honesty, and she said, did you also have a conversation with your communities about how they felt and what they needed to help inform how you change things?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we didn't necessarily need a conversation. They were screaming at us. I mean, you get a sense of it sometimes, don't you? And I think so. The idea of the business breakfast was absolutely that. The idea was we would have breakfast. We would talk for 20 minutes while they had their bacon sandwiches, and then for the next hour and a half, we just pin our ears back, and they would go for it. And actually, over the years, that's become far less confrontational and more about how do we do things together to make it forward. So that, I mean, we use those mechanisms as a way of just listening, just pinning our ears back and listening. But also in terms of sometimes with your community, they don't know what they haven't experienced sometimes. And I think what Eden can do and what universities can do in particular is give people a much wider insight as to what is possible and what the future could look like. And I think framing those conversations with the local communities has been an important part of how Eden's tried to get away from just queuing on the highway or litter on the roads, stuff that is really important but also drives you crazy because it's kind of, it doesn't get you any further. So framing those conversations has been an important part of that conversation.
Thank you ever so much, Dan. Very, very helpful and an inspiring story. Thank you.